My name is Sarah, and for years, my family had a phrase they used whenever they wanted to explain why my sister got things and I didn't. Because she actually tries. That's what my mother said when Melissa got help with her first car. That's what my father said when Melissa got the down payment for her condo. And that's exactly what my mother said, standing in her kitchen, the week before she passed, when she told me the house was going to Melissa, because she actually tries. I was 34 years old, and I still remember standing there thinking, tries at what, exactly? Nobody ever finished that sentence. They never had to. It had worked on me for over a decade. I want to take you back to where this started, because you need the shape of it before I tell you what happened after the funeral, and what happened in that lawyer's office 3 months later. I was the older daughter. Melissa was 2 years younger, and from as far back as I can remember, she was the one my parents understood. She was outgoing, she was loud in the right ways, she filled a room, and my parents loved that about her openly, constantly, in a way that never felt complicated. I was quieter. I liked numbers. I liked being alone with a spreadsheet more than I liked being at a party, and somewhere along the way, my parents decided that meant I wasn't trying. Not that I was different. Not trying. It showed up in small ways for years. Melissa got new clothes for school. I got hand-me-downs that had already been hers first. Melissa got driving lessons paid for. I taught myself in an empty parking lot on weekends because nobody offered. When I got into a solid state university on a partial scholarship, my father's first comment was, "Good, that'll save us money for Melissa's school." Not congratulations, just a budgeting note. I filed it away, the way I filed away most things back then, quietly, without comment. Here's the part that matters later. When I was 26, my grandmother on my father's side, a woman named Ruth who I adored, and who was, frankly, the only person in that family who ever seemed to actually see me, left me a small inheritance when she passed. About $60,000. Nobody else knew the exact number, and I never told them. I used part of it to finish my accounting certification, and I invested the rest, quietly, in shares of a small regional logistics company my grandmother's old business partner ran. A man named Walter Grimm. Walter had known me since I was a kid, back when I used to sit in the corner of his warehouse office doing homework while my grandmother handled deliveries. He liked that I asked good questions. Over the years, as I built a career in finance, Walter and I stayed close, and he kept me updated on how his company was doing, half out of friendship, half because I genuinely understood his numbers better than most people on his own team. None of that mattered to my parents, because none of them ever asked. My mother's version of me, fixed sometime in my early 20s, was a quiet, unambitious daughter who worked some office job and never really pushed for more. She never updated that file. Not once. Not in 15 years. My father died when I was 29. Heart attack. Fast. The kind that doesn't give anyone time to prepare. My mother carried on for another 5 years, and Melissa moved back in with her not long after, officially to help take care of her. Though from what I saw during visits, most of the actual caretaking fell to a part-time aide my mother hired herself. I offered to help pay for that aide. My mother said, "Melissa's got it handled. Don't worry about it. You've got your own life." I did have my own life. I just wasn't sure anymore why having one seemed to count against me. My mother passed 4 years ago, quickly, from an illness that gave us maybe 6 weeks of warning. I flew back and spent every one of those 6 weeks at her bedside, taking leave from work without much explanation to anyone, because some things you don't want to turn into an announcement. Melissa visited often too, I'll give her that. She wasn't a villain in this story, not really. She just never once questioned the arrangement that had always tilted in her direction, because why would you question something that's always worked out for you? A week before she died, my mother told me, in that same kitchen where I'd absorbed 100 small comments over the years, that she'd decided to leave the house to Melissa. She said it gently, like she thought she was being kind by explaining it to my face, instead of letting me find out from a lawyer. "Melissa's going to need it more," she said. "She's never really gotten on her feet the way you have. And honestly, sweetheart, she's always been the one who actually tries around here. You've always managed just fine on your own." I said okay, I didn't argue. I'd learned a long time ago that arguing with that particular story about myself never once changed the ending. What she didn't ask, because she never asked, was what managing just fine on my own had actually come to mean by that point in my life. She didn't know that I'd been quietly advising Walter Grimm's company for years, unpaid at first, then eventually for a modest consulting fee, because I genuinely enjoyed the work. She didn't know that 18 months before she got sick, Walter had come to me with a serious problem. His son, who was supposed to take over the company, had walked away to pursue something else entirely, and Walter, getting older and increasingly worried about what would happen to the business and the 40 or so employees who depended on it, had asked me, directly, if I would consider buying in as a controlling partner, not as a favor. As a real transaction, backed by my grandmother's original investment, my own savings, and a financing structure I'd built myself over about 4 months of careful work. I said yes, quietly, the way I did most things. By the time my mother sat me down in that kitchen and explained why Melissa deserved the house more than I did, I already owned 62% of Grimm Logistics. My mother never knew. I never told her, and I want to be honest about why. Part of it was privacy, but if I'm being fully truthful, part of it was that some tired, worn-out part of me had simply stopped expecting her to be curious enough to ask a real question and wait around for the real answer. So I stopped offering the information voluntarily. That's a hard thing to admit, but it's true. The will reading happened about 3 months after the funeral, in a small office belonging to a lawyer my mother had used for years, a careful man named Arthur Boyd. Melissa sat across from me, already looking a little apologetic, which told me she at least understood, on some level, that this wasn't entirely fair, even if she'd never said so out loud while our mother was alive. The house, the modest savings account, my mother's car, all of it went to Melissa, exactly as promised. I got a small collection of my grandmother's old jewelry and a letter, handwritten, that I hadn't been expecting. Arthur read part of it aloud, the part my mother had specifically asked him to read in front of both of us. It said something like this: "Sarah, I know I never fully understood the life you built, and I regret that more than I can say now. Your grandmother always told me you had a sharper head for business than anyone else in this family, and I think, somewhere along the way, I decided that meant you didn't need me the way Melissa did. I hope I was wrong about what that cost you. I hope whatever you've built quietly out there, it's more than enough, and more than I ever gave you credit for. I didn't cry in that office. I'd done most of my crying already, in the 6 weeks before she died. But something in that letter landed differently than I expected, because it was the closest my mother had ever come to admitting she'd been reading the wrong file on me for over a decade. Here's where the story turns, and I promise I'm not telling this part to make myself look impressive. I'm telling it because it's simply what happened next, and it happened without me planning it that way. About 4 weeks after the will reading, Walter Grimm passed away unexpectedly. A stroke, sudden, no long goodbye the way my mother got. Because of the ownership structure we'd built together, control of Grimm Logistics passed fully and immediately to me. Overnight, at 38 years old, I became the sole controlling owner of a company worth, by conservative estimate, somewhere north of $4 million, employing 43 people whose families depended on paychecks I was now, in a very real sense, responsible for. I didn't announce it to my family. I'm not built that way, and honestly, some tired part of me still expected it wouldn't matter much even if I did. But word travels, especially in a small town, and Melissa found out about 6 months later, from a mutual acquaintance who mentioned, in passing, that Grimm Logistics had a new owner, and wasn't it interesting that it was Sarah, our Sarah, the quiet one. She called me that night, and I could hear in her voice that she genuinely hadn't known, not any of it. She asked if it was true. I said yes. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I've thought about a lot since. She said, "Mom always said you'd manage just fine on your own." I don't think she had any idea what that actually meant. I told her I didn't think Mom had any idea either, and that I wasn't angry about it anymore. Not really, because being angry at someone for not asking a question they didn't know they needed to ask felt like a losing game I'd already spent enough years playing. I want to be honest about how this actually ended, Because I know these stories sometimes wrap up with some grand gesture, some moment where the wronged sister finally gets her triumphant reveal in front of the whole family. That's not what happened here, and I think that's more true to how most of these things actually resolve. I didn't buy a bigger house to prove a point. I didn't cut Melissa out of my life. She got the house, and I let her keep it, because taking it from her wouldn't have given me back a single one of the years where I quietly stopped expecting anyone to ask. Instead, I did something smaller, and honestly, it mattered more to me. I set up a small scholarship fund through the company, in my grandmother Ruth's name, for kids from working families who show real aptitude for business but don't have anyone at home telling them they're trying hard enough. Every year, I read the applications myself. Melissa and I talk more now than we used to, not because either of us fixed something dramatic, but because she started asking real questions, actual questions, about what my days look like, what I'm building, what the company actually does. It's a small thing, it shouldn't feel as significant as it does. But after 15 years of being the daughter who apparently didn't try hard enough to earn a real question, having someone finally ask one still catches me off guard sometimes. In a good way. I think about that kitchen a lot, the one where my mother explained, gently and with total certainty, why Melissa deserved the house because she actually tries. I've stopped being angry about the phrase. I understand now that my mother wasn't lying when she said it. She genuinely believed it, because she'd never once looked closely enough to see otherwise. What I've come to believe instead is this: trying doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like sitting quietly in a warehouse office doing homework while the adults around you handle the real business, and paying close enough attention that 15 years later, you're the one holding the deed. You don't need anyone to notice you trying while you're doing it. You just need to keep doing the work, quietly, for as long as it takes, and eventually, the truth tends to sign its own paperwork.